online and in the room. Hope you can get a drink and sit down, then we'll get cracking. So the purpose of today is to celebrate the end of term. So we've got students here from 5 different master's programs, and we wanted to celebrate with you the end of the term, hopefully the start of an exciting dissertation term that's coming up. And those people who are working in ESI, who are not here on master's courses, obviously celebrating Easter holiday coming, and it should be a lovely event. So we're very pleased that James Dyke is going to give the talk this evening, and then we'll have time for pasties, drinks and chit chat afterwards as well. So thank you all very much for coming. Can I just have a roll call for students on the different master's programs? So renewable engineering, no show. Mining engineering. Hey, would you like to come down and join us? You're very welcome. There's even pasties and drinks. Mining engineering, yay, good on you. Applied data science, where are they? Conservation and policy, yay, welcome. And sustainable development. Yes, very good showing. Thank you all very much for coming. Well, Rachel's obviously got ways and means. And obviously colleagues from the ESI as well, warm welcome. So we're here to celebrate the end of term 2, as I said, happy Easter. And James Dyke is the best person we could possibly imagine to give this talk, because he is a colleague from Exeter, so he works at Stratton in geography and teaches the MSc called Sustainability Solutions. But he's also stuck his head out, neck above the parapet recently by talking about net zero and raising critical questions. So it's just the kind of stuff we want to talk about as students and researchers. James has had a very interesting career already. He has a PhD from the University of Sussex. He then did a postdoc at Max Planck Institute in Germany. He then worked at the University of Southampton, where I always used to work in the 1990s. So that's a nice connection. And moved to Southampton, moved to Exeter even in 2018. And he's, as I said, in the geography department. James is unusual because he's also a public intellectual and writes regularly in the Independent, or the Eye as it's called now. And you might have seen his columns, and he does have a public profile well beyond the academy, which would be very interesting for us to hear about that tonight. So he's going to talk about, as it says there, net zero, fact, theory and wishful thinking for about 45 minutes or so with some discussion. And if you're up for it, he's keen to take comments and questions as he goes. So if anything you want to say while he's talking, stick your hand up and raise it as a question. Otherwise, we'll have lots of time for questions and discussion at the end. So over to James.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, many thanks for that very kind introduction, and many thanks for the invitation, and many thanks for turning up for the free wine. So I'm under no illusions as to why you're here. And I'm under no illusions why all the sustainability students are overrepresented when it comes to getting the free stuff. That's the first thing I tell all my students. So well done. I'm very happy to take questions, but I prefer a bit of a discourse, a bit of a discussion. So if you have any questions or comments, then feel free to, put your hand up or just shout. I'd rather that than you leave. But I'm also happy to take questions at the end. So when we're talking about net zero, who's heard of net zero? Who hasn't heard of net zero? Who heard about net zero 10 years ago? 5 years ago? Okay, well, there are some professionals in the room. I went 4, 3, 2, 2. It's kind of, last few years, last couple of years. But now everything's net zero. Net zero by 2050, net zero by 2030. Net zero has become the dominant framing for our efforts to avoid dangerous climate change. So in hopefully 40 minutes, it's going to be much longer. I don't know, there's so much to talk about. I will do my best to keep it to 40 minutes. I'm going to try and explain where I think net zero has come from, how it's helping, and maybe how it's maybe not so helpful, and try and shine a light on some of the facts, the theory, and quite a lot of wishful thinking that there is around net zero. And and welcome for those people who are joining us online, including Amrita, who I wanted to meet today because she's been organising everything. You're amazing. Maybe in the pub later. Right, so what we're going to do, does any of this work? That doesn't sound promising. Hang on, maybe I need to... Okay, right, so I think the reason I'm here is because I wrote an article with colleagues, friends, was it last year? Climate scientists' concept of net zero is a dangerous trap. We don't write the article headlines. I always say that. I'm not an editor, I'm not a sub-editor, I never write headlines. And some people thought this was a rather provocative headline, and it is. But that's what editors and sub-editors are good at. They're good at getting people to read articles. But in this, we try and we make the argument as to why net zero might be a counterproductive way of addressing the climate challenge. Okay, so I want to acknowledge my co-authors on that. So it's Bob Watson and Wolfgang Knorr. And everything that I'm about to say that's wrong, that's because of me. And all the good stuff is because of the contributions from Bob and Wolfgang. Just very briefly, Wolfgang and I are currently working on a project together. I'll get to that at the end, because I'm also here on a recruiting mission for something, a very exciting new project, and Wolfgang is working with me on that. Wolfgang's largely left academia. He's given up, basically. His background was biogeochemistry, Earth system modelling, climate science. He was at the Max Planck as well. He was in Hamburg. I was in Yale in biogeochemistry. He was in the Max Planck for climate science or climatology and meteorology. And basically, he's given up trying to affect change through academia and is becoming essentially, I suppose, an activist or an advocate for climate action. For those who don't know, Sir Robert Tony Watson, or Bob, as everybody calls him, he was the previous chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He was the inaugural chairperson of the IPBS, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. He's largely retired, and now he writes these great big synthesis reports and briefs presidents and prime ministers about how we're hurtling towards disaster. And I think we worked with Tony with Bob to capture some of his frustration after decades of working in this area. Repeated reports, repeated warnings that were largely being ignored. So I was pleasantly surprised by how strident Bob wanted to be in this article. And it did quite well. It got picked up by a number of people. Greta seemed to like it. I don't know how many views it's got. I tend not to worry about that anymore. And I'm just going to read out this thing that she thought was interesting about it. The time has come to voice our fears and be honest with wider society. Current net zero policies will not keep warming to within 1.5 because they were never intended to. They were and still are driven to protect business as usual, not the climate. Now, when I wrote that, I thought that was obvious. Of course they're there. When you understand anything about the climate policy system, that's what climate policy is for. I've now discovered that that is not a sentiment that is universally shared, and that some people think that's maybe even inflammatory language, or perhaps even potentially counterproductive. So part of what I'm trying to do this evening is convince you that that is true, or it's an accurate representation of where we are in terms of climate policy. Because this is where we are. Now, I don't mean to disparage the efforts that people have been, their entire careers have been put into trying to bend this curve. Right, so we're talking about decades of science, decades of policy, decades of activism, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, millions. Arguably, the movement for climate justice is the largest social justice movement in all of human history, right? It's there's a tremendously powerful sense of agency you can get when you realize just how many people have been desperately trying to bend that curve. But whatever we seem to throw at it, emissions seem to go up. Do you remember Build Back Better a couple of years ago? I was talking about that. I was giving interviews about that. I was writing articles about how we must not, make the colossal mistake of just shuttering the global economy, and then when COVID passes, we'll just turn all that fossil fuel infrastructure. Now is the time, seize the moment, of course. We've 2021 emissions are probably going to be the second largest increase ever recorded by humans. And there's still no sign that we're slowing down that curve. We haven't reached the inflection point, and we know we need to get to zero. And consequently, emissions, If emissions are going up on the order of about 40 billion tonnes a year, then concentrations in the atmosphere, which have been inexorably rising since we've been measuring them since the late 1950s, you know all about the Keeling curve, right? So until we get those emissions down to zero, that's going to go up, basically. So the good news, and this is where we start our story about net zero, is basically the amount of warming that we've got in the pipeline, the amount of warming that we're going to see in the future, thus far it's about 1.1, 1.2 since pre-industrial periods, is directly proportional to how much extra carbon we're going to put in the Earth's atmosphere, right? So what we've got here is the historical warming signal. This is the empirical data. This is kind of, surface temperatures. And we can see this is degrees Celsius here, and we're around about, 1.1, 1.2. But this axis here is not time, right? When you first look at this, yeah, it's getting warmer over time. It has been getting warmer over time, but the units on this axis here are cumulative CO2 emissions, right? And because emissions have been increasing over time, then we can just kind of swap time for cumulative emissions, and that's where we're going to end up with the amount of warming that we've had. Some climate scientists still can't quite believe there's such a simple relationship between cumulative emissions and warming. Almost like a straight line, right? When you think about how complex the climate system is, it shouldn't be a straight line, but it is for lots of complicated reasons. What this means is that if we continue to produce carbon dioxide emissions, then we're just going to get more and more warming, right? There is some lag, there's some momentum, inertia in the system, but essentially, so first order approximation, if we stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow, global warming stops in about 10 years or so, and there's going to be lots of longer term dynamics. But in terms of the proximate issue that we've got right now, getting this limited warming to some amount, basically stop burning fossil fuels and land use change. Stop putting carbon dioxide. Stop increasing the greenhouse gas effect. So this is the basis of net zero as it stands today. Cumulative emissions, warming. Because as soon as you get those emissions down to zero, warming stops, right? Which is what we all want. Because we want warming to stop at some point here. Ideally, well below 3 degrees Celsius. And yes, there is significant uncertainty, clouds, feedbacks in the climate system, and these different coloured regions relate to SSPs, which some of you know all about, but I will briefly explain later on. They're just different kind of future scenarios. To what extent are we going to get our act together to limit warming to no more than 2 degrees Celsius, or are we going to continue just to burn all the coal, oil and gas that we can, and then we might pump up concentrations such that we'll see 3, 4, 5 degrees Celsius by the end of this century? Where is all this coming from? Well, fossil fuels mainly. Here we've got global carbon emissions. So this isn't CO2, but it's carbon emissions. And you can see, yes, land use change is important. That's why we all need to be vegetarian or vegans, or at least eat less beef, right? And manage our land better, waste less food. But you can see coal, oil, and gas. That's pretty much the lion's share of CO2 emissions. I don't know why it keeps doing that. Sorry. So it's still the case that when it comes to global energy demand, or supply rather, 80% is satisfied by fossil fuels. Coal, oil and gas produce 80% of all the energy that humans use. Still, 80% is about the same fraction as it was 10 years ago. What about all that wind, wave and solar, all this, exponential deployment of these renewables? Yes, there's been tremendous increase in the deployment of renewables, and there's also been a tremendous increase in the amount of energy that humans consume. So, it's like running on a treadmill, which is getting faster and faster. Until we get that to zero, emissions are going to continue to rise. So the issue that we've got is we've got to turn the tap off, right, as quickly as we can. Some people, if you ever had any interactions with, I don't know how best to describe them. Some people actually advocate we should just turn off all fossil fuel infrastructure tomorrow. In fact, we should sabotage it, we should blow it up. If we did that, then probably billions of people are going to die. So I'm going to make the assumption you don't want billions of people to die. So the challenge that we've got is to turn off as quickly as possible whilst transitioning to our alternative energy sources. Now, when it comes to our efforts to limit warming to low, let's say 2 degrees Celsius, and I'll talk about targets in a bit, there's this realization that some sectors are going to be hard to decarbonize. Right? The classic ones are aviation, jet aircraft, which burn kerosene, and things like cement manufacturing. There are no wide body electric passenger aircraft anytime soon, right? There are algal-based biofuels, but I don't think there's any prospect they're going to be scaling up anytime soon, right? Also, there are billions of dollars invested in the existing commercial fleet, and they're not just going to suddenly throw them in the bin, right? So we've got these things, and they're going to continue to emit carbon dioxide. We've also got alternatives to cement, which has zero carbon, or iron, which has zero carbon, but these are kind of nascent technologies, and again, we just don't think we're going to be able to decarbonize them fast enough, right? Eventually, yes, but next 10, 20, 30 years, we're still going to see emissions from sectors like this, hard to mitigate sectors. This is the argument, right, around net zero. So you've got this notion of carbon neutrality, right? So this is where we're kind of getting into net zero policy areas. We've got to get the emissions down as quickly as we can, but some sectors are going to be hard to decarbonise. So really, you think about if we're going to still emit carbon from jets, then we need to work out ways of getting that carbon that was emitted by jets back out of the atmosphere, right? So if you're going to emit a ton, you've got to take a ton out, right? And we're all familiar with carbon neutrality. Yeah? There's various definitions of net zero that I could pluck out of the ether, which kind of sound a bit like carbon neutrality. Simply put, refers to the balance between the amount of greenhouse gases produced and removed, right? So net zero is you might emit 10 billion tons, which is okay if you can also remove 10 billion tons, or you can emit 1 billion tons and we remove 1 billion tons. Everything must break even so we get to zero, right? But net zero is something else. I've tried lots of different ways to try and explain why net zero is something else, and I always fail. But I think every time I do fail, I get a little bit nearer to what it is I'm trying to explain. So what's net zero? Well, it includes not just carbon emissions, but all greenhouse gas emissions within something called a science-based targets, as opposed to relying solely on offsetting. And the key point here is this thing called science-based targets. Net zero doesn't just mean you know, if we're going to emit a certain amount of carbon, we're going to remove it, because that's just carbon neutrality. Net zero is about basing climate policy on these things called science-based targets. And the foundation, certainly the contemporary foundation, is this kind of model here. Cumulative emissions, total warming, you want to stop warming, you want to get emissions down to zero. So this is kind of like the scientific foundation of all net zero policies. No one's going to disagree with that, right? And that's all pretty basic stuff. And the story that we tell in the climate policy world is something like this. Science determines the impact of warming, right? So we've got IPCC Working Group 3 coming, which is about mitigation next week. Previously, it was IPCC Working Group 2, which was about impacts. You know, what does 1.5 mean for coastal communities? What does 2 degrees mean for food security? Things like this. These are scientific questions. There's social science. Within Working Group 1, the physical basis of climate change, we've got a much narrower framing or understanding of, you know, well, how much warmer is it going to get as a consequence of emissions? But this idea that science determines what warming is going to do, then society determines what we're happy with. What constitutes dangerous climate change or safe climate change? To put it crudely, how many people are we willing to see die before we reduce emissions to zero, for example? How much of the natural world are we willing to erode or destroy before we get emissions to zero? And these are societal questions, right? These are questions which politicians struggle with, which climate negotiators from around the world meet up at conference of parties, COP26, this year's COP27, in order to basically work out what is the threshold? How much warming are we going to be happy to live with? And then, okay, this is kind of got a mind of its own at the moment, right? Then, if there's a threshold, there's an amount, then what we can do, we can tell scientists what's the budget you've got, given, you know, cumulative emissions and total warming. So if you want, I don't know, at 1.5, then you've got about, I don't know, 500 billion tons or so of carbon that you can put into the atmosphere, at which point, no more, right? And if you're going to put it at a rate, 30, 40 billion tons a year, then you've got a period of time by which you've got to get to net zero. So we've got to get to net zero globally by, let's say, 2050, in order to make sure that we've got a good chance of limiting warming to 1.5 or something, wherever you think, you know, the threshold for warming is. And then we're back to society again to determine, well, how do we manage that? Well, who gets to burn it, right? You've got the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities. Developing nations need more time to burn their coal, oil and gas resources because they're still industrializing, whereas rich industrialized nations like the UK, which have reaped all the benefits from industrialization, we need to decarbonize faster. So we shouldn't be net zero by 2050 for the UK, it should be 2040 or 2035, or like last week. Yeah. So you can see how science is kind of interleaved with the societal dimensions of what we think are initially, almost subjective, science-based policies, right? But they're not objective. They're intimately entwined with societal considerations and politics and everything that goes with it. So you've got science-based policy, for example, the Paris Agreement 2015, limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and all that entails, right? But it's a two-way street. If you've got science-based policy, you also have policy-based science. You've got policymakers determining the scientific questions or framing, right? And that's not just a crude sense of where you're going to get the money from, right? UKRC is going to give you a certain amount of money at the moment to research, let's say carbon removal technologies. It'd be that crude. But just more generally, the notion that there is this kind of tabula rasa when it comes to what academics or scientists are going to research is just false. They're social agents, just like anybody else, and they will research particular things. And so if you've got science-based policy, you've also got policy indirectly and directly informing what is being researched and how scientific questions are even being framed and navigated. Now, the predominant way in which we do this in the climate policy context is with these things here. Anyone know what these are? You do, nobody wants to say. These are integrated assessment models, and these are possibly the most important models that most people have never heard of, because it's these things which are going to get reported next week as part of Working Group 3, because it's these models which are producing the scenarios whereby we think we're going to limit warming to no more than 1.5 or 2 or whatever, right? So there's only 6, really. I mean, look at how Working Group 3 works. It's not a large number of people who are making some very big decisions on what goes in to the analysis and what is left out. Right, and they produce things like this. So here's the amount of emissions we've actually got, historical emissions, and then we've got these future worlds. These are not predictions, not even simulations. They just say, look, if you want to keep warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, like the Paris Agreement, then this is what you've got to do. You've got to see emissions come down and then end up here. But hey, look, if we just carry on burning as many fossil fuels as we can, then we're going to end up in a 5 degrees plus Celsius world. Of course, we're never really going to get there, because by the time you get to 5 degrees Celsius, industrialized civilization has collapsed, right? So these don't include the feedbacks that come from climate change on society and industries, right? But these are different pathways that society might take in order to decarbonize. Right. Now, there is an awful lot of what I'm about to say which is essentially repeating what other people have said. So it's been quite embarrassing. When we wrote the paper and when we were doing lots of seminars and I've been doing other work about it, you always like to think you're saying something new, right? You've got a contribution. And then, to my horror, I've discovered loads of stuff which has basically been making exactly the same arguments. So here's a nice article that was lead authored by Wim Carton. And really, Wim has been doing a lot of work in this area for years, right? One of the things from this paper, I just want to highlight a few takeaways. So definitely read this paper. It's really good, right? Net zero didn't come out of anywhere. It just puff out of the ether, right? It's built on a very techno-economic framing, typically being conducted by integrated assessment models. Right? All models have assumptions. All models are good for certain things, and they're not very good for other things. And there are a vast number of assumptions which are going into integrated assessment models. Therefore, there are a whole vast range of outcomes which are not being considered or are considered not policy relevant for something. And it certainly is a techno-economic framing. The assumption that we only have incremental policy changes, you can't have big government inputs. We assume that markets are going to find optimal solutions. You can't propose explicit degrowth policies, for example. All of those kind of assumptions get kind of hidden in a relatively small number of integrated assessment models. Here's a good one. Earlier scholarship, particularly from the critical social sciences, is seldom engaged with. Yep, right? Oh, should we let her in? She's in there. Seldom engaged with. I never heard of it. right? It's only since I've been working in this area that all these social scientists have been saying exactly the same thing for years, right? It was only when 3 middle-aged white men rock up to the party, right, with a kind of a physical sciences background, that suddenly people are listening. Maybe we can talk about that in debate. Why is that in the discussion, right? And this final point here, there is a continuity, right? The discussions we've got about net zero and something called carbon removal, you can put into a wider context of the stories that we've been telling ourselves about climate policy for decades. Hence some of my skepticism and some of my pessimism about how net zero is figuring in this longer story. So let's just go back a little bit, being mindful of the time, to the way we could pick up the story. We could pick up the story, you know, with Eunice Foote, right, in the late 19th century, or, you know, Tyndall and the landmark experiments on the relationship between greenhouse gases and surface temperature. But let's jump in with Jim, right? Jim Hansen, 1988, landmark testimony, in which he tells US politicians, we can be clear that we see the signal of warming in the surface temperature record, and we can be clear that humans are responsible for that warming because of increased emissions of greenhouse gases. And we can also be clear that if we continue doing this, it's going to get bad, right? There's going to be sea level rise, extreme weather, crop failures, there's going to be a whole range of impacts. Worst case scenario, civilization can actually be, you know, at threat at some point over the next 100 or 200 years. Did we listen? Well, kind of. 1992, Rio. Most of you are not alive then, I'm going to assume, but this was a landmark conference. We've got things like the Rio Declaration. I mean, some of you studying this, like, you know, the formation of the UNFCCC, Commission on Sustainable Development. We've also got the first sort of framings of what is climate change and what is dangerous climate change and what we should be doing. The idea being the ultimate objective is the stabilization of greenhouse gases that will prevent dangerous. Now, there's been lots of argument about what dangerous means, Copenhagen, Paris, various COPs. There's kind of general consensus now that it's well below 2 degrees Celsius. Used to be 2, now it's 1.5, because there's an increasing understanding that beyond 1.5, many low-lying island nations wouldn't exist anymore, right? They just become extinct. But we can see, at least in the early 90s, there's this appreciation that we've got to stop burning fossil fuels. Right? The Kyoto Protocol, yay, we did it, right? Didn't we? Because we were going to cut by 5%, you know, greenhouse gas emissions from something like 2008 to 2012 or something. There'll be a period, it's always about 10 or 20 years into the future, but there'll be this period where emissions would have come down because we would have rapidly transitioned away from fossil fuels, and we would have done a few other things too. Of course it didn't happen. Humans have put more carbon into the Earth's atmosphere since 1990 in those 30 years than they did in the previous 300 years. We haven't even slowed down, right? So we keep on burning fossil fuels. At the time of the Kyoto Protocol, and when they were thinking about, well, how are we going to stop carbon emissions, there was already the argument of offsetting, right? There was already the argument, certainly proposed by the United States and other nations, that natural carbon sinks, such as the large forests in the United States, well, they absorb carbon, right? So really, when you think about national contributions, the US should be allowed to burn or emit at least as much carbon as its forests absorb, because then it's kind of net zero. The same argument that other nations, typically petrostate nations, are making today. So you can already see we're kind of trying to fiddle with the books, you know, really see the emergence of the kind of net zero arguments. And at this time as well, we've also got the earliest integrated assessment models being formed. This by Bill Nordhaus. I don't really have time to talk about it a lot, but it's really important because it assumes optimal. The name of the game in climate policy has never been to try to reduce emissions as quickly as possible. It's never been the name of the game. The name of the game has been to try to make as much money whilst reducing emissions as quickly as possible. And you can mitigate too fast. If you reduce the use of fossil fuels too quickly, then you will produce a brake on economic growth, and therefore there'll be massive opportunity costs, such that in 30 years' time, the global economy will not be as big as it would have been if you'd taken it a little bit easy. So climate policy has always been about trying to thread the needle and find an optimal kind of mitigation path, avoiding dangerous climate change, but also avoiding the catastrophe of slowing down economic growth. And integrated assessment models then, I mean, Bill's model was, I mean, you know, you run it in a spreadsheet, a few lines of code. As in today, assume a perfect world, a world in which markets can find optimal market-based solutions, a world in which governments only ever make small nudges, they can't tell people what to do. It's a fantasy world, really. Okay, the other thing I need to mention at the early 1990s is clean coal. Because if you think about what was most responsible for emissions then, it was coal. And the idea that we'd stop burning it was like, no, of course we're not going to do that. It's generating an awful lot of electricity. So here we see the other component of net zero, which is the carry on burning component, but then we'll deal with those emissions at source. It's called clean coal. Now we know the problem with coal. You burn this hydrocarbon. It's a very dirty fossil fuel, and it produces pretty much the most carbon you can, bang for buck, right? Thermal coal. But what we do when we burn it in a power station, we will capture, not in a net, right? This is a metaphor for some kind of chemical catalyst. We'll capture the carbon dioxide before it escapes and does its naughtiness in the climate, and then we'll bury it. We'll just put it somewhere underground so that it can't interfere with the climate. Therefore, we can continue to burn coal. It'll be great, right? So this is an example of what we call caption carbon storage. Anyone seen this one from Juice Media? Just Google Juice Media, carbon capture and storage. I can't play it because the language is very salty, but they're brilliant. They do a whole series of honest government adverts, and the CCS one is fantastic. So that's your homework. And it's not a new idea, right? So we're talking about the 1990s. Capture carbon, store it underground. What wizardry is this? It's an old idea, right? This is a grab from the Carbon Capture and Storage report from 2020. And you'll see there are a large number of commercial facilities in operation, right? First thing to note, I don't know if you can make out here, you've got the capacity. Good luck finding out how much carbon is actually captured. It's really, really hard to find out. It's all commercial information. It's typically not publicly disclosed for various reasons. But look, when operation date 1972, 50 years ago, right? 50 years ago, and the Tyrrell natural gas processing plant, they have been capturing carbon dioxide and have been doing something. Basically, when you extract fossil gas, methane, a lot of carbon dioxide comes up with it, often. And typically that just gets vented to the atmosphere. And what they realized is that they could capture that carbon dioxide and put it to use. What use were they going to put it to? Can we guess? It's basically enhanced oil recovery. It's get more oil out of the ground. That's why we've been doing it for 50 years. There's a direct commercial motivation to do it. That carbon dioxide is a valuable resource because what you can do, is let's say you are burning coal to generate electricity, or maybe smelting iron or something. What you do, you capture the CO2 with scrubbers from the chimney, then you pump that down, you compress it, then you pump it down into an oil well or oil field that's been depleted. Because you keep taking the oil out, you're going to reduce the pressure. So what you do, if you pump CO2 back in there, you pump the pressure back up, you can drive the remaining oil back into the wellhead and therefore recover more oil. You can then recycle that, so you can put more carbon dioxide back in. So basically the motivation is to get more hydrocarbons out. And when you do the maths and you look at the additional oil that gets produced, then you're actually emitting more carbon dioxide into the Earth's atmosphere than you could have done if you just let the CO2 out, outgas into the atmosphere, right? That's why we're good at it, right? That's one of the reasons why there are many industry champions for it, because we've been doing it for 50 years and we know how to do it. We know how to do carbon capture. So whenever you hear CCS, you must always think CCUS. It's carbon capture, utilization and storage. At the moment, there's practically none of that, and it's all of this. This is what we use CCS for. Right? It's CCUS. Now, as you could probably guess, clean coal never took off. It was a complete failure. Why was it a complete failure? Because it defeats the object or purpose of burning coal. We burn coal to generate electricity because it's cheap, right? You start putting scrubbers on chimneys and all the infrastructure to compress the carbon and then put it somewhere in geological storage, like just leave it under the ground. It makes it more expensive. And there's never been the economic incentives to make clean coal work. So it doesn't. It's never worked. And I would say it never will. We'll just never have the economics. We'll never have the price of carbon for clean coal to ever take off. Okay, so let's fast forward a bit to Paris. A tremendous achievement, right? People going in there thinking, are we going to get this global agreement? And we did. We did for the first time, and we can't, you know, it's really important. The first time, pretty much the entire international community agreed what was dangerous climate change, well below 2 degrees Celsius, and that we all have an obligation, a responsibility, in order to make sure that we do whatever it takes to stop warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. Great news. Just going to mention one person here, Farhana Yamin. Farhana has been a long-term climate advocate, champion, protester, lawyer, and a real key figure in the success of the Paris Agreement and championing the real responsibility the richer nations have. You know, common but differentiated responsibilities. Richer, industrialized nations need to go much, much faster, and we need to set the threshold for dangerous warming much, much lower. Okay, so what did this look like in 2015? So let's say we want to limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Well, look, if we'd have started back in, let's say, 2000, you follow this curve around here, we would have needed to decarbonize at a rate of about 4% a year. To put that number into some kind of context, at the peak of the lockdown in 21, we saw there was about a month in which emissions were contracting by about 7%. Right, so basically, we just turned off a significant fraction of our industrialized civilization, and we managed to get it to about 7% for a month or two. If we would have started like 3 years ago, then we give up using percentages. It's just like monumental, right? And then if we would have carried on by about 2030, basically there isn't any carbon budget left, right? There's, you know, if you've got 500 billion tons or something, you know, within about a decade or so, there isn't any budget left. So how on earth did we agree in 2015, and how on earth do we continue to say that we are keeping 1.5 is still alive? You know, Alex Sharma talking about the outcome of Glasgow, you know, 1.5 is still in play, we can still do it. When we aren't even seeing emissions slow down, they're going up, right? And we're practically out of time for the budget. So what is going on? Well, at the time, it was already thought, and it's back in the Paris Agreement, that such steep mitigation is impossible, right? Impossible. I don't know anyone. I always get in trouble when I say this. At the time, I did not know anyone who worked in climate science who thought that we had any chance of limiting warming to 1.5, given there was practically no budget left, right? So I think the notion that it was impossible was, yeah, the only way it's going to happen is with very large negative emissions. But of course it assumes it's impossible. It's not impossible. Remember, it's a societal decision. It's a societal decision at which rate we mitigate, which rate we decarbonize. There's no reason, there's no physical reason, there's nothing in the law of thermodynamics, which means we couldn't limit warming to no more than 1.5. But certainly when it comes to policy assumptions, it's not going to happen, right? And how are we going to do it? We're going to do it using CDR, which is carbon dioxide removal, right? Which use these things called net. You all heard of CDR and nets and stuff? So carbon dioxide removal, net, remember net zero, we just got to get the carbon out of the atmosphere. Carbon capture and storage is basically we'll burn coal and then we'll get the emissions before they get into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide removals will invent new technologies or new ways where we will take the existing concentrations of CO2 and we will lower it. And we'll lower it using things such as a basket of technologies, a kind of a wacky races basket of technologies called nets. There are billions, hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars in finance and government funding stampeding down the highway all around nets. Because if this doesn't work, we are, you know, right? So, you know, industrialized civilization, it's all based on nets. You can see that's what the framing is, because we've got to get CDR to work. We've got to get the concentrations down. So net zero, using those science-based targets on emissions reduction and carbon removal. This is what net zero means. Of course, if you offer more of this, then you also may be able to do less of that, right? If you offer the future promise from all of this, then you remove the immediate needs to do more of that. And never underestimate every single politician's willingness to not do this, given a whole bunch of assumptions about the link between emissions and economic growth. I'm not going to talk about that. You know what I'm talking about. Right, so if you look at, for example, Paris compliant, well below 2 degrees Celsius, what does it mean? Well, the first thing is that we're now kind of a flip of a coin. When you look at the IPCC, if we do all these Herculean things, it's got to the point where basically we think there's a, 1 in 2, a 0.5 probability, a flip of a coin. So we might do all these things and we still might get more warming than we would hope for. But the real takeaway here is that any Paris compliance scenario, it is assumed is that it's going to go deep into this red area, this net negative global emissions. And the take-home message here is the longer that we delay bending that curve, the longer in which we delay actual mitigations, the deeper you have to go into net negative emissions, where you've got on the order down here, something like 30 billion tons. So at some point around the end of the century, I would say we, but it's not me, some of you, because you'll be around, and your kids or my grandkids, by the end of this century, we're going to have to work out how to remove as much carbon from the atmosphere as we currently put into the atmosphere, right? Because it's just net zero. And the framing is all net zero by the end of the century. How are we going to do that? How am I for time? Okay.
5-10 minutes.
I'll fly through this bit. How are we going to do that? Who's heard of BECS? Anyone? BECS? Kind of. No, it's not quiz. I'm not going to ask you. 10 years ago, no one heard of BECS because probably didn't actually exist. There's a really interesting story about where BECS came from, maybe later. BECS means bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. And it was assumed that this was the savior technology. That's how we're going to get all that. That's CDR, right? What is BECS? Well, before we talk about BECS, we need to understand that it did become climate change savior technology, right? We're saved, thank God. Paris is still in reach. How do we do it? It's clever scientists. Those boffins have done it again. Although, read on. Even though they've yet to be demonstrated at commercial scale, negative emissions technologies, typically BECS, are now included by climate scientists in the majority of modelled pathways showing how the world can avoid dangerous climate change well below, right? All that is BECS, certainly from about the last 5 years or so. That's how we get underneath. You think, okay, so that's quite important. And then you realise, well, it doesn't actually exist yet, right? It came from, I'm not going to talk about it, right? The most important thing, it doesn't actually exist anywhere at scale. What doesn't exist? In principle, it's really simple, right? What you do is you take biomass. This could be naughty first-generation biofuels. That could be actual food crops, which you're taking literally from the mouths of people. And instead of putting it to the mouths of people, you put it into the mouth of a car, or you make biofuels with it. Or it could be second or third generation. Anyway, you've got biomass, right? And you can make biofuels. Then you can use that to produce, for example, electricity. So classic one, you cut down a tree, make wood pellets, and you burn it in a thermal power plant that previously was used to burn coal. Right? Now, that is a carbon neutral system because as a tree grows, it's going to take carbon from the Earth's atmosphere, and if you burn it, it's just going to put it back. But here we've got the twist. You've got the carbon capture and storage twist. You would then capture the CO2 that gets emitted when you burn the tree, and then you bury it, right? Now, because you're burying it, you're taking it out of the atmosphere, you're actually able to generate electricity at the same time as reducing concentrations of CO2. Because if you grow lots and lots of trees and they suck down lots and lots of carbon, you burn it and you capture the CO2, you're dragging down carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. It's fantastic, right? And you get electricity. What's not to love? Well, there's a few problems with that idea. The first one is where you're going to put it. You've got to put it in geological storage. You've got to stay there for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. Basically, you've got to become mineralized, turns into limestone or something. We've been trying to do that. Classic example is the Gorgon project. You might have heard about it. It's in Australia. They've been trying to separate carbon dioxide from natural gas processing and then demonstrate you can put it in geological storage, right? So that's half of the problem. Where are you going to put the carbon? it doesn't work. Well, it does work, but it's really difficult. The geology is challenging. It's really expensive. It's over budget. If you just Google Chevron Gorgon, you will find a whole series of articles about how they've continually failed to be able to store significant amounts of carbon. It's really hard. And we're going to have to do this at scale all over the world. And every single injection site is probably going to have different geology. It's not just going to be able to spin up or scale up like we can for solar panels or something. But the other problem that we've got with BECCS is where do we get the biomass from, right? And what it's done is actually accelerated the deforestation of some old growth forests around the world, including Europe and, you know, most famously in Central and South America. You have got quite predatory businesses going into some places, virgin forest, and flattening it in order to take those trees, those high biodiversity areas, in order to pulp them so they can be burnt at a power station in North England so that rich people can charge their Teslas. It's a catastrophe. And so there's increasing understanding and awareness that what was meant to be the savior technology is not going to work. It's not going to scale up at anything like the rate at which we wanted it to in order for it to be able to have an impact on something like the Paris Agreement. And of course, then you've got competing land use issues. We're not just going to destroy indigenous forests, we're also going to undertake widespread afforestation, which sometimes means moving people who are currently in the way, people who might be using that land to produce food or have been living there for some period of time, in order that Western companies or rich industrialized nations can plant significant numbers of trees in that area in order to be able to burn it to keep the lights on in their rich homes. So let's not do that, right? So we don't talk about BECCS. Well, we do talk about BECCS anymore, but it's not the flag waving, okay, great, here's the solution to everything. So here we are, I'm coming to the end of my talk, right? And again, I just want to recap that I don't disparage, and I'm extraordinarily grateful for the Herculean efforts that everyone has put into, on this timeline, the various conferences of the parties. All the way back in the early 1990s in Berlin, right? The Rio Summit in '92. We're talking to hundreds of thousands of people who spent decades desperately trying to bend that curve. And you see, in the crude instance of what the curve has done, they've had no impact whatsoever. But underneath, we are seeing a widespread energy transition. We are seeing huge changes in policy, huge changes in finance. But the message at the moment is just wait, hold on a moment. We'll actually see it translate into a reduction in emissions. It's a very, very finely poised situation. I think we're at a critical moment, and maybe a moment of peak danger, because until that comes down, it's moot. The climate doesn't care about our intentions or policy. All it cares about is concentrations of CO2. So where are we now? What's the next savior technology? You might have read about it. Direct air capture. Climeworks made the news last autumn, I think. There was a large facility that was going live in Iceland. It's like a big air conditioner. You can suck CO2 directly out of the air, and then you capture it and then storage. Okay, you've got the storage problem, but you don't have the problem with, chopping down lots of trees, yeah? It's all going to take an awful lot of electricity and a lot of money, but let's ignore that, right? It works. Here it is, Climeworks. It actually exists. They built it. And it will be capturing and storing 4,000 tons of carbon dioxide each and every year. And let's remember what we need to do at the moment. We currently emit 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide. I will say that there is no current pathway whereby technologies like this are going to scale up at the rate we need them to do, which is going to have any significant impact on our efforts to avoid dangerous climate change, let alone how we're going to actually pay for it or the energetic requirements. I think I'll leave it there on that one. It can have an impact. For example, this is CO2 fertilization. Capture CO2 and you can make crops grow faster. There's lots of cool things you can do with CO2, but you're not going to have an impact on global climate change. To conclude, it's not all doom and gloom.
Really?
It's not all doom and gloom. We can do something. First thing, we need to put in twin targets. There's something of a movement, I think, going on at the moment, whereby you've got NDCs, nationally determined contributions from different countries as part of the Paris framework. When are you going to be net zero by something? It's bollocks, right? What we need to understand is how much are you going to reduce your emissions, and then those remaining emissions, what are your plans for removal? We need to separate them out. At the moment, there's far too much hiding of the promise of future removals in what sounds like very, very ambitious net zero targets. Classic example is being Shell, I don't mind mentioning them, where they're making the serious claim that they'll get to net zero, including scope 3, i.e. the emissions that their oil and gas produces. How are they going to do that? They're going to plant a load of trees, right? That is their net zero policy. Make clear what the twin targets elements are of climate policy for countries or organizations. I think that's a really constructive way, because we need a laser-like focus on this. If we don't do mitigation, that is pointless. We might as well not bother. If we don't see large-scale near-term mitigation, then we are literally wasting our time. We need to level with the public. 1.5 means net negative, and all that entails, the costs, the entire new industries we've got to develop. It also means overshoot. So this is from working group 1, but it was echoed in working group 2, and it will certainly be echoed next week. These are those different integrated assessment kind of scenarios, and this is the Paris compliant one. You think, well, how are we going to keep warming to no more than 1.5? Well, look, by around the middle of the century, we're in what we call overshoot. We have been in overshoot scenario for years. In fact, we've always been in overshoot scenario. This is the most optimistic scenario that we've got. We're going to exceed 1.5 or 1.7 or 2 or something around the middle of this century. And then with large scale deployment of carbon removal, we will drag that temperature down by the end of the century. This is how some people maintain that we are still able to honour the Paris Agreement, because as long as we get it down by the end of the century, that's fine. But we could see a large excursion, and all that entails in terms of additional climate feedbacks. We've got to base the removals on robust science. There is so much bullshit around. No, remember, there's so much money. There's so much incentives to big up the possibilities and the technologies. This constant kind of magical thinking. Where is it? It doesn't exist now, but don't worry, someone's going to come along at any moment and just pull that rabbit out of the hat. It was BECCS, not going to work. It was direct air capture, it's not going to work. Next year is going to be something else. There's going to be some other wonder tech. The narrative of typically a white Western man coming along, might be called Elon Musk, might be somebody else, who's going to magic something up that's going to solve the crisis. And there's so much psychological, not to mention economic investment in that narrative. Someone's going to come along and save us, and I just don't think it's true. We know what we need to do. It's really hard, and it's actually much harder than generate or invent new technologies. And the last thing is, I think we are now well into the territory where academics have got to become much more engaged in the climate and ecological crisis. Often we'll talk about or teach about the crisis. I don't see many people acting as if it's a crisis. It's a very relaxed kind of crisis. Cigars in a lounge at the end of the evening and having a nice conversation. There are some people acting like it's a crisis, but many academics are not. So we need to get them to step over the line. We need to help academics. We need to empower academics to become much more engaged and active in what is potentially, a fight for our survival. So let's just recap. Remember Jim Hansen in the 1980s, probably the most famous climate scientist in the world at that time. I mean, not that famous, but can you think of any other climate scientists? Landmark testimony in the late 1980s. And here's Jim getting arrested in 2011. He was arrested a couple of times. I think it was it 3? This was in a protest outside the White House, where he was, and along with some other people, protesting against the US government's inaction on climate policy. And Jim got to the point where he felt his only contribution to the policy debate was to basically undertake direct non-violent action and end up being arrested for it. Well, let's think about Farhana as well. A key figure when it comes to the Paris Agreement, and here she is with Mary Edwards, right? Another key figure in the success of the Paris Agreement and the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities. And here's Farhana in 2019 being arrested by the police after she superglued herself to the offices of Shell HQ in London. It's part of an XR protest. You can actually see a little XR banner, right? So you can see there's a number of academics who are going through this kind of journey, many decades in some instances, of increasing frustration, increasing alarm, and realizing that nothing is fundamentally changing. Of course, the longer we leave it, the more fundamental the change needs to be. And their only response really is to do some kind of direct action. Well, you'll be glad to know that I don't want you to get arrested, although if you want to, fill your boots. I'm working with Wolfgang and a bunch of other people. It's called facultyforafuture.org. This is a holding website. But if you go there, visit it, you can join us, which sounds quite ominous. It just means a newsletter at the moment, don't worry. And we've got lots of plans, we've got lots of wild ambitions. We've actually got quite a lot of money to try and engage academics and empower academics and academia in order to become much more effectively engaged in the climate ecological crisis, make academia, fit for purpose. I think if I'm doing the same teaching that I'm doing right now in the next 5 years, I won't be able to live with myself. I think that's my motivation for getting involved. And finally, a donut. If I was going to summarize my talk about net zero, what is net zero? It's a donut, right? Who's heard of donut economics? We all heard of donut economics. I know Kate, and I'm a big fan of Kate Raworth and her work. And I think donut economics has got tremendous potential to really transform a lot of policy from all the way, national, local government, But I think there is another form of donut economics, and it's this. Because whenever I love donuts, and every time there was one in the cafe, I almost bought it to make the point. There was a lovely, they put all the sugar on it and it kind of glistens in the light. I love donuts. And there's a part of me that thinks, you shouldn't eat the donut because you've had quite a few calories today. You shouldn't eat it. But then the other part, don't worry, I'll go to the gym tomorrow, right? This is what net zero is. It's donut economics. Have the fossil fuels today and don't worry about the consequences, because tomorrow we'll remove those excess calories. We'll take away, the naughtiness that comes from eating that donut, from burning those fossil fuels. It's literally instant gratification. Our society, our industrialized societies, not all of them, but the vast majority, are built on not just consumption, but hyper-consumption. Whether it's a donut or a Tesla or a high consumption lifestyle, skiing twice a year, immediate gratification, notions of well-being, peer respect, it's all built on consumption. And doesn't net zero tell us a wonderful story that we can carry on with our lives as we have been accustomed to them and not worry about the consequences? Because some point in the future, someone's going to make it all go away. I'm afraid it's just not true. Sometimes you have to skip the donut. Right, thank you very much for your attention. Cheers.
James, that was a great talk. Loads of very depressing information. Who wants to chip in with questions, comments, points of disagreement? Yeah, Marcus.
You essentially looking at the net zero perspective, but how much is part of the kind of conversation things like solar radiation management, any other areas which is like outside the actual.
I think I need to repeat the questions for people
Sure.
online, probably. I don't know if, Amrita, you were able to hear that, but Marcus was saying, what about other engineering things? Yeah.
Yeah, so who's heard of solar radiation management? Who hasn't? Okay, so SRM is when the idea of SRM comes from volcanoes. So when volcanoes erupt, they produce a lot of particulates, sulfur, and that goes right up into the Earth's atmosphere, and it kind of reacts with chemistry and forms very reactive particles, which works as a kind of a sunshade. And so when you've got large, like Pinatubo is the classic one, when you've got large eruptions, you'll see global temperatures go right down for about a couple of years until it all rains out. And so scientists, larger scientists said, well, why don't we do that intentionally? So if we intentionally inject some kind of particulates, some kind of aerosols into the atmosphere, then we could reduce temperatures. And you've got other solar radiation management ideas, big mirrors in space, disco balls, put them into orbit. And at the moment, it's still quite a taboo subject. It's very controversial. I know some people who are doing the active research on it. And there's lots of reasons why people consider it taboo. One, the moral danger, because you're allowing people to say, well, don't worry, we don't even have to do carbon dioxide removal, we'll just do geoengineering. But the predominant concern at the moment is that when you look at climate models and you introduce geoengineering, then you can, for example, completely screw up the monsoon. in like the Indian subcontinent or something. You can produce vast regions of drought in the Sahel. You can have profound regional and maybe even global climate impacts. But the people that I know are doing the research are motivated to do it because they're pretty sure, or they feel convinced, that we're not going to mitigate in time, that there's no real viable carbon removal tech. And when it does kick off around the middle of this century, when you're going to see, the first mega lethal heat waves, there's going to have to be something that's going to buy us some time, maybe, and the good thing about geoengineering is it's practically instant. You'll see an effect as soon as you put the particulates up there or something. So on the one hand, I think they're completely motivated by the efforts to keep us safe, but the assumptions they're based on are really quite frightening because they've assumed everything else has failed, right? And then when we get to that point, if that then fails, well, then obviously the consequences are even worse. That's really depressing, isn't it?
As a follow-up, essentially the idea, I guess, is related to the fact that suppose that if you look at, say, for example, the US or any developed nations, a lot of the cities are suffering sea level rise, and they might suffer a lot of consequences. So technically, the US would say we can't afford to really sink and the regular temperature. We don't care what the consumer.
Yeah.
So that's I guess the danger is what we talked about earlier, the optimization of the consequences for you. I guess that's where the motivation comes.
Yeah, so if you're motivated to reduce temperatures over North America, you can do that, but you'll have impacts, in potentially the other, teleconnections of the climate. You can have impacts, pretty much all over the rest of the world. And so how do you regulate? How are you going to manage? At the moment, essentially, there's a moratorium. Every now and again, some billionaire goes out and starts doing some geoengineering thing, like throwing iron filings or something into the sea, ocean fertilization. There's even been some, sulfate kind of experiments. But at the moment, in terms of international law, I think the position is you can't do it. But at some point, if the situation does get bad, somebody is going to do it, right? And so some of the research that I see is motivated by, well, at least we need a better understanding of what that means,
I think we should take a few comments and get more people in. So one here, then there, and then there. Yeah. Cool.
So I wanted to ask you a bit about the twin targets and basically how do we actually differentiate the parts of material especially now that there's this push to just, basically, end net zero in terms of initiatives that are actually supposed to target what's supposed to be mitigation, what's supposed to work. So, the Tory Net Zero Scrutiny Group or whatever Nigel Farage and the well-funded trolls are up to now, basically that is their focus also. So there's an element for me of this kind of, communicating it and basically how it might actually undermine the actual mitigation efforts, because there's absolutely valid and very important critiques like the one that you're doing now, which we need so much more of. And then there are the net zero critiques, which are basically meant to undermine all the actual mitigation efforts. So, and especially given that the general public probably I'm not sure if it would necessarily actually tune into your whole talk to listen about the intricacies of that. And in terms of just the messaging and how do we actually mitigate as much as we can in the short time that we have, how do we navigate that with the twin targets and actually making people realize that the mitigation side of things is where the solutions lay, whereas the removal is where that dangerous trap is. So what do we do about that?
Yeah, really good question or comments. So the Net Zero Scrutiny Group, they've been trying to initiate that as part of the latest chapter in the culture war in the UK. I'm reasonably relaxed about it. I just don't think it's going to get the traction. And it's just a tool for them. It could be net zero, it could be anything else. The reason they've called it net zero is because that's just what the framing of it is, but they've got practically no understanding of removal limitations or anything like that. It's all about cost. Right? It's all about you mitigating too fast. Those working in the policy net zero. So like the, the like Race to Zero campaign or the Science Based Targets Initiative, all these folk are really, I would say, in my opinion, I think they're really concerned about the credibility of net zero, because at the moment, I mean, the motivation, you want to make it as big a tent as possible. So they're kind of, we've got this many businesses signed up. 5,000 businesses now have net zero targets, right? So it needs to be as inclusive as possible. But there are bad faith actors coming in who are basically using it to do nothing but greenwashing, right? The classic example being Shell, right? So, I've got a net zero target, but it's crap, right? And so I think they are really worried that it's going to undermine the credibility of net zero and kind of the value of the brand. So there's increasing efforts they're doing now to try to work out, well, what makes a good net zero policy and what makes a bad one. So I think the twin targets approach is really good. Because if you look at a net zero policy, which basically doesn't really talk much about near-term mitigation, then you can just toss it, right? They might think about all these exciting startup technologies and having, that's great, right? But if you're not going to produce some credible plans for mitigation in the next 5 years, then really you are relying on the promise of future removals. And so the space they've got to navigate is increasing the pressure on people to really come up with credible mitigation targets, whilst also trying to get them in the tent. Because if they put the barrier of entry too high, then they're not going to get people to participate. I think it's an impossible job they've got, but I'm glad they're doing it. And as regards to, Farage or the Net Zero Scrutiny Group and a very small number of Conservative MPs, I think I'm relatively relaxed about it. And just in terms of how quickly policy can change, and we haven't even talked about the Ukraine crisis, and there are serious discussions now on demand reduction. So I think they're just, he'll trim his sail to something else. It'll be something else in a few months' time, right? It won't be net zero. That's my prediction.
You talk about market economic growth as one of the reasons that there's been a big drive towards carbon capture rather than actually reducing emissions. To what extent do you think the incorporation of climate and ecological measures within economic and alternatives to GDP have a role? Like, are they feasible? Are they useful?
Yeah, so people are, the idea that GDP is not a very good measure of government or social progress, I suppose, is an old one, but it's come to dominate discourse around economic policy. So whenever the UK enters a recession, it's front page news, right? And exchequers and prime ministers are judged on the performance of the economy. It's a really, it's because we've got a kind of a debt-based growth economy that we have to continue to grow the size of the economy in order to service previous debt, and on a landscape of increased supposed innovation. Therefore, you've got to increase the total size of the economy in order to ensure that people have enough work to do. But when you're thinking about what is economic policy for, whose interest does it serve, and what makes a good policy or a bad policy, I think there's tremendously exciting ideas that you could use other metrics and measures, right? Personally, I guess it's no coincidence that GDP is very closely aligned to the welfare and wealth of a relatively small fraction of society. It's so that's why it's become so dominant, especially in the world of global commerce. But no, it's a terrible measure.
Do you think it's feasible that it would be replaced?
It's inevitable that it will be, right? Because nothing's forever. Obviously, the job that we've got is to do it as quickly as possible and replace it with something better. You might think a national happiness metric or quotient, like Bhutan and places, they've got, richer measures that would employ, social science to try and calculate whether or not people are happier or not. But you don't have to squint very hard to see that could go quite badly wrong, depending on, you're some kind of dictator who has determined that people are happier now because I've measured it in a certain way, or what makes people happy. At the moment, the very crude measure, if I give you more material possessions, if I make you richer, you're going to be happier, right? But this abundant, it saturates out. More money doesn't make you happy, right? There's a vast increase in well-being that we've got with regards to, let's say, the bottom billion in terms of the global distribution of wealth. A small increase in their wealth will be transformative. But by the time you end up living in a rich industrialized nation with a certain level of income, it kind of just, how many Xboxes do you really need? Or, it doesn't make a huge difference. And then we're back to issues around redistribution of goods and services in our societies, which perhaps is where the real discussion is.
Pre-2016, I remember a lot of people saying things like they're fairly relaxed about the Brexit referendum. Mm-hmm. They will never get traction, they will never win. But the far right of the Tory party and Farage and people like that, they managed to get it. Mm-hmm. I think it would be a mistake to dismiss this, and I think we should get our own defences in position in the way of climate justice and just transition, which is my area of interest. Anyway, that's not my question, that's just a comment. My question was that post COP26, Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia commented, and he said that we've got the technology to sort this thing out. There's green hydrogen, solar is generating cheapest electricity in history. Mm-hmm. But we've got the wrong people in the room discussing it. We should have the engineers in the room with the help of the scientists to sort this thing. What do you think about that? Do you think this is sortable, or is it a wicked problem?
Well, I mean, it's in terms of technology, it is eminently solvable, and that we don't need to. Some people say, well, you need nuclear fusion or something. We don't. We've got all the generation that we would need because we've already got sufficient resources. There's more than enough. We go back to the previous question. We've already got sufficient energy, material, and wealth, so that nobody needs to go hungry. But we live just in the UK. There are increasing numbers of people who have to decide whether they go hungry or cold because they're either in food poverty or fuel poverty, right? So the reason we care about climate change is because we care about the well-being of people. That's what climate justice is, right? That's why we have 1.5 as being the threshold, because the UK will probably be all right at 1.5, but other places literally won't exist. So it's this kind of maddening situation where we've already got sufficient resources and the technology. But of course, that speaks nothing to the power of the incumbent systems, and that you've got, if 80% of all energy is generated by fossil fuels, then that wealth has built the political systems that we're now trying to reform. So it's no surprise that the chairperson of Saudi Aramco didn't wake up one day and go, you know what? I think, I've been completely convinced I'm going to completely dismantle the world's wealthiest commercial organization that, the world has ever seen, right? It's, and the tremendous amount of motivated reasoning that very good people have to continue to burn fossil fuels, because it's their fiduciary duty to their shareholders. So, their organization employs tens of thousands of people all around the world, or that if they were to suddenly stop operations and they plunge civilization into collapse, right? If you take it from an engineering first principles perspective, you can see where we need to deploy the technologies and where the connectors would need to go, and in the round of sorting out land use and food waste, all these things, of course you can do it all. But all of that kind of evaporates in the face of power, then, doesn't it? So whilst engineers and scientists should be in the room, it's not them that makes the decisions. Scientists advise and politicians decide, is what we're told. Sorry.
So I just wanted to explain that the reason why I mentioned the whole Brexit thing is because Farage and the far right of the Tory party, they are using poverty as an excuse.
Yes.
They say that net zero will cause poverty. Yes. That's why I mentioned the just transition.
Yes, they're suddenly interested in the well-being of some of the most marginalised people in our community. But I mean, I completely understand your point, right? They could produce, and they are trying to produce, a narrative that's going to cut through and talk about, metropolitan elites completely disconnected, driving around in their Teslas with their solar panels on their roof, whereas somebody who has to struggle to, keep warm doesn't want to hear that, right?
Hey, Thomas up there.
Yeah, so it's kind of a bit decoupled from the greenhouse gases part of the discussion, but the fossil fuels also, I know, produce a lot of particulate matter, which I think by most moderate estimates say it leads to hundreds of thousands of direct or indirect deaths because of that. So, and recently, because I got kind of interested in that, I started looking at air, like particular charts and things, and it's actually, even here in Cornwall, it's not really that good. A lot of days it kind of gets into the danger zones. So I guess my question would be, is there any consideration of that in UK's net zero, or those kind of things? Do they think about that? Or is that something, because I know that would be reduced if we just stop using fossil fuels, but in terms of mitigation, is there any way that that can be mitigated? Is there any plan around that, or is it just ignored?
I think when it comes to things like NDCs or nationally determined contributions, it isn't, right? There was some back of the fag packet calculations when they were looking at, because air quality significantly improved during the lockdown. You could look at industrial regions in Europe or China, and the significant reduction in, let's say, PM 2.5 pollution, and then you could work out how many fewer people are going to die.
Yeah,
It's that, because the numbers are so large, because the health impacts of particulate pollution are so big. You can come up with quite robust estimates. Thousands or tens of thousands of people. So if you were looking at public health policy, what's one of the biggest things you could do? The biggest transformative action, probably get a handle on particulate emissions. And in the southwest, it's industrial, but it's also agricultural emissions as well. At the moment, that is almost entirely separate from the discussions we've got about net zero, because it's all about the temperature target.
Yeah.
Right?
So why is it intimately linked?
Well, if you care about people, if you're motivated to, you want to reduce human suffering, then it's a bit moot if that person has died from lung cancer or as a consequence of heat stress. So it's not very integrated. When you look at things like the Sustainable Development Goals, there are kind of efforts to see, well, obviously, how do they interact? So action on the climate is often seen as being the hub, because you can't do the other ones really if you've got an unstable climate, right? But then when you look at some of the other analysis, you realise at the moment the way in which we conduct business, they're almost mutually exclusive. You can't do them all. If you do this one, you make that one worse, because we've got constraints in certain ways in which we do policy. So I think, when it comes to climate policy, the things that are not going to cut through about, what about your kids, or who gives, whatever. But things like immediate health impacts, so reducing particulate emissions from road vehicles, right? Most people don't know how much PM gets produced through cooking with gas at home, or your gas-fired boiler, or your gas fire. So you make it an immediate health concern, and I think you're going to get much more traction. You're taking out these really quite dirty, polluting devices in your home, and you're replacing it with a nice clean heat pump or something. So you make a much more proximate health-based consideration, as well as cost, right? It's going to be cheaper, rather than the very diffuse kind of, we've got to avoid dangerous climate change by the end of the century or something.
Yes.
I've had.
One very quick aside from that is that what's your opinion? Nasty question. On if we will just switch to nuclear, right, and that would probably solve to some extent the need for greenhouse gas burning, but of course nuclear is not very popular for various reasons. How do you think that fits into the kind of options for the future? Like having a giant mirror is one option, or having nuclear power station. Like, how do you see that? Does that play a role?
Yeah, well, the thing with nuclear, we can't just switch to it. It seems to take about 20 years to build.
Yeah, to put it away long enough.
Yeah. So I mean, and then the argument is that's because regulation is too constrictive, right? So like modular reactors, smaller reactors, we could deploy them much faster. I'd certainly prefer nuclear fission to sulfate injection, solar radiation management. Right? I think the issue with fission at the moment is that we need to keep it for as long as possible. So I think the early decommissioning of German nuclear power reactors was probably a terrible mistake.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a kind of classic example, and we should probably be using the systems that we've got for as long as we can, until we can then safely replace them with something like renewables, like solar or wind or something. So I've got no ideological opposition to nuclear power. It's just we need to be really careful about how quickly we can do it and how badly it's been managed and typically is managed. And be realistic about the timescales in which we can deploy this stuff. I mean, look at Hinkley. I mean, it's just, anyway, right.
Jake Horsley's been waiting online very patiently, and after him I've got Juliet. So they're my last two, and then got your name.
Basha.
Basha, that's right. Basha will ask the final one. So Jake, do you want to put your camera on and ask your question?
Sure thing. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, that's a miracle.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. That was a really interesting presentation. A bit doom and gloom, but it's great to hear it. I wanted to ask, what gives you hope? What gives you hope for the future in a very one-way presentation? What gives you hope?
You give me hope, Jake. I think, it sounds really trite, but it is my students give me the most sense of hope, because they don't take any shit. They see bullshit for what it is, and they've got the most skin in the game, right? So that gives me, so the hope is not technologically based. I don't believe that we're going to come up with some kind of magic technology, although I think innovation is going to be important. But I think it's the new thinking from younger generations who maybe don't have as many constraints in their minds about how they see the world. And I think there's moderate causes for optimism about that. You know, when you're talking about, let's say, degrowth, 5 years ago, no one's talking about degrowth, really. Certainly not in, let's say, Parliament, although there's been an all-party parliamentary group about limits to growth for a while now. But I think you've got some noise being made about alternative economic models. Underneath, I think a lot of these problems is this pathology of growth, let's say. So when you can do systemic and fundamental changes like that, which is typically coming from younger generations, then I suppose that's my greatest sense of hope.
Yeah. I don't really want to follow that, but I think I wanted to bring it a bit more local in terms of the institution that we are all in, the university, as a sort of case study, if you like. So Net Zero, the university a few years ago set its Net Zero target. It has put effort into whether it can deliver those. And then it gets really complicated in how it delivers it. It gets really expensive when they look at the predictions of what they've got to do to change that in the time available. And also they've got to be, if we're thinking about, does that mean not growing as much? And are they the only fish that stop swimming in the HE sector, if you like? Are they, how do we do this? So now the question is, actually, do we need to do much more offsetting in that to reach those net zero targets? And that's what they're kind of proposing and how they do that. So how, as an institution, do we do it? Let's have the answer now.
All right. Is Lisa listening, do you think?
None of us as academics or students believe in net zero or believe in the kind of offsetting idea. How do we actually do it honestly?
Well, funny you should ask. What is the mission of this university? What's it for? What's the purpose of the... I saw that cynical person. He was making money symbols. Well, one could be forgiven for thinking that its financial considerations are kind of at the bottom of everything, right? So, I mean, previously I talked about a CEO of an energy major, like an oil company, who can't just suddenly decide that they're going to, cause their entire industry to become extinct because shareholders, the people who work for them, their suppliers, entire industries. We're continually told that we need to support extraction of North Sea oil and gas because of all the people who work in, in Scotland, north of England. There's hundreds of thousands of people involved in that industry and the ancillaries of that industry, and we've got responsibility, right? And that reasoning happens in a university, right? So really an important function of the university is to continue to exist. You're not going to have a senior management team come to the conclusion, you know what, I think we've had our time, we had a good run. Best thing we can do is fire everyone, close the buildings, basically rewild the infrastructure, we'll go learn crafting or something, I don't know, whatever. You know, it's not, the institution itself, you can look at it as an agent or an entity, and it kind of demands satisfaction and to be serviced, right? And I don't think the university is any different from any other organisation, right? So the prime directive of the university is to continue to exist. Not only that, it's in the landscape of higher ed in the UK, which is to grow, probably grow international numbers, at least put a floor on home students, look at new ways to generate revenue, look at new, you know. So it's a kind of a growth-based paradigm, you know. And is that really consistent with getting to net zero by anything? Are you really going to zero out your impacts if you've not only got to get from where you are, but where you're going to be in 5 years' time or 10, which is more, right? And so you can do one of two things. You can either look at that and have the deep, introspective and very, very difficult discussions about what is the purpose and mission of the institution, or you can say, well, we'll offset it, right? And I think every time you're gonna offset it, because, you know, in order to be able to have those kind of discussions, they're going to be an awful lot more involved and deep. Now, about the university, at the time when we're having this discussion about the university to declare a climate and ecological emergency or climate emergency, it was happening all over the place, right? You know, and there was this, well, who's going to be first? You know, and Bristol rocks up there in its usual trendy way, and we said, Exeter do it, you know, Exeter do it. And at the time, there were a few voices, quite a few senior voices being quite resistant. And they weren't being regressive. They were saying, look, we can't declare a climate emergency because we don't know what it means. It's all very well us saying, well, we declare a climate emergency and we'll be, I don't know, net zero by something, but we don't know how we're going to do it. And so they said we shouldn't. And I said, well, that's exactly why we should do it. Because if the institution really knew what it meant, then it would never declare a climate emergency, and none of those organisations would either. If they really understood what an effective response to the climate crisis is and get to net zero by 2030 or 40 or whatever, they would never do it because no one has got any plan for how they do it. And it's not because they've got a plan of how they're going to offset or do the mitigation. They don't have a plan for how they can reorientate the mission and the purpose of the institution. But my argument then, I think now, is look, that's okay. You put the wedge in, and over time, you just got to drive it in so you can do that institutional evolution. It's not going to happen overnight, and it might be a bit difficult. But look, the HE sector, we do change, right? I mean, it's constant change. We're constantly assaulted by the latest innovation from either government or UKRC or the VCs or, you know, Universities UK or something, with this constant maelstrom. Why can't we use some of that energy to do some of the reorganisation and the refining, or maybe even repurposing, such that we could actually get to net zero in a way which doesn't require a lot of offsetting? So I think the significant reliance, or the increasing reliance on offsetting, is basically inevitable of us coming up to speed. So what does it mean? Then is with twin targets, if you insist on taking it away, no, you can't have it. Or if you're going to have it, you can have it when you've got a science-based removal, which, but you know, so I'll give you this much, which means you've got to do more here. So this kind of relentless pressure, and I think we'll move it around, but it's a lot more difficult than anyone ever really thought it would be. Was that diplomatic enough?
Juliet's been doing a very good job at pushing the university to do more, but it is damn difficult. So yeah.
Well, when you know wherever the bottom line is, you're asking people to do things which is not only difficult for them, but perhaps completely diametrically opposed to their mission. Right? Yeah. My job is to, and then you come along and say, well, actually, maybe it's not. It's no surprise. There's even with the best will in the world and everyone involved and thoroughly engaged in it, it's why it's going to be so difficult.
Well, I'm going to give the last word to Bashan.
I just wanted to ask, it ties into the previous question. So kind of from the institutional to the individual level, because institutions move very slow. I think it's also something to do with the Faculty for Future work that you're doing. But what is that midway, for instance, for individuals who are already frustrated with the state of affairs between publishing papers and getting arrested?
Yeah.
What is that space and what does it involve?
Exactly, yes. So one of my motivations to get involved with Faculty of Future was there's got to be something, you know, go to EGU or spend the night in jail. There's got to be a happy medium somewhere. And I think academics got an awful lot more responsibility, yes, but we've got a lot more voice. So if you look in terms of respected professions, yeah, estate agents, sorry, actually some estate agents are lovely, right? But in terms of, you know, trustworthiness, estate agents are you know, and politicians are quite low. We look at what's atop, doctors, medics, and also academics, right? Now, some people say, yes, the reason that is, though, is because we don't get involved with really these kind of policy or politics issues. And if we were to increasingly become involved, then that could erode some of the trust, because that trust is meant to be based on our objectivity. But I think there's other ways of ensuring scientific objectivity than literally walling yourself off, you know, and inhabiting your little ivory tower. I think if we got a bit more engaged, if it was a bit more bi-directional, if we got more engaged in understanding what does society need from academia, rather than the idea that we'll generate knowledge and just chuck it over the wall and let society deal with it. So fortunately, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit when it comes to what we can do as academics. For example, you could just join the newsletter. That's right. So I think there's an awful lot we can do, and we can make a really positive contribution.
That is a very good note for everyone to go and have a pasty.
It is.
Because we're now on almost 2 hours of talk, so I think we should draw it to a close, but please do stay for a pasty and a drink and a chat with James one-to-one. It's been a really good session, hard to hear, but really very useful. And so a big round of applause for James. And thank you to everybody online who stuck with it. Hope you could hear it all. And to Amrita, who's done so much of the organising, and Mark and Kate, who've organised pasties and drinks and everything else. So thank you to everyone, and stay for a drink.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Great. Shall I get